Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. Tyler here, and we have another great episode today. We are going to talk deacons. And so perhaps you're in a local church that mobilizes deacons as leading servants. Perhaps you're in a church that has a different structure. And so this episode may raise some questions for you. And if it does, feel free to reach out. podcast@tobeethechurch.com is the best way to do that. And if you're listening on your podcast app, consider heading over to YouTube and watching the new video podcast of this episode. So let's get right to it. Well, we're joined right now by Matt Smethurst, and Matt is the managing editor at the Gospel Coalition and also an upcoming church planter. Matt is getting ready to plant a church in Richmond, Virginia. Is it River City Baptist Church? Is that the name of the church?
You got it.
Very cool. And we're going to talk about a book that Matt wrote recently, but before we do that, let's talk church planning for a minute, because that's something that we here at Northwest Gospel Church and at To Be the Church podcast talk a lot about. What was the impetus behind River City Baptist? How did God lead you there?
Yeah, it's kind of a constellation of different factors, and all of which kind of converged in 2020. Virginia is home to both my wife and me, and so we've had a desire to return there and for me to be a lead pastor in Virginia. We also have some friends in Richmond that we've been in touch with and have just told us of the growth of the city and therefore the need for more gospel preaching churches. And it's where the International Mission Board, the largest mission sending agency in the world, is headquartered. And so any chance there is to get to support and serve and be a good model kind of from ground zero of gospel centrality and healthy church, the better. And then, yeah, just as I've gotten to know certain Richmond pastors, the chorus of those voices has just confirmed my sense from afar that the rate of new healthy churches is not keeping up with the population growth. And God kind of provided a way for us to go. And so we decided that church planning was how he was leading us. We'll see how it goes. Kind of feels like building a plane in the air. But it's invigorating and definitely a chance to walk by faith.
That's cool. What has your relationship with the local church looked like these previous years before deciding to plant River City?
Yeah, on weekends, I usually will either by myself or with my family just kind of go out into the woods a little bit to be with God. No, I'm just kidding. We belonged to Third Avenue Baptist Church here in Louisville for almost 12 years, and I've had the privilege of serving that congregation as an elder for the last 6. And so that is our sending church. They're very much excited to champion this new gospel witness being born in Richmond and to send us out in about a month.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so let's talk deacons. One of my roles here at the church is to kind of oversee our deacon structure. It sounded like I was going to say deconstruction, but that's not what I said. Deacon structure. But to oversee that. And so when I saw this little book on one of my coworkers' shelves, I thought, oh man, I need to order that. And so I recently ordered it, read it straight through, and then the minute I was finished, I thought, man, we need to have Matt on the podcast to talk about this. But let's see, why this book? Like, why did you choose to write it? Obviously, it's a part of the 9 Mark series, so they're writing books on like the different, things that make a church healthy. But why did you feel the passion to write this little book here?
You want the honest answer or the answer I wish I could give?
Let's hear both of them. Yeah.
I wish I could say it was the book I was born to write. I've wanted, it's been a burden on my heart. I just had to know. The honest answer is that 9 Marks and Crossway asked me to write it, and I can't recall, maybe I didn't get back to them, or I said maybe, and they asked me again. And one of the things, so I certainly, I've served as a deacon before in actually 2 diaconal positions, and I've also seen it from the other side as serving as an elder. So it wasn't a matter of not believing that deacons are strategic and valuable in the life of the church, but it was more just wondering what I would uniquely bring to the table. But what really convinced me to write it was when I heard from both Crossway and Nine Marks that this book is basically one of their most requested books that didn't yet exist. In fact, deacons is the number one most searched for term on the Nine Marks website every year. And so it's surprising to me that it's the last one in the series when there's such a demand for it. And so I did my best. I did a deep dive into the subject and tried not only through research and reading, but also through interviewing actual pastors who have been in the trenches for decades, working with deacon boards for better or worse. I just tried to get a sense of the landscape and then produce something that would be helpful and accessible, something that even a pastor could hand to a deacon, and say, here, there's a lot of confusion out there. Here is your biblical job description.
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of confusion out there, and I'm thinking through people listening to this right now, and there's going to be a plethora of different experiences or maybe even different baggage that comes with this term deacon. And so let's start with, what biblically is a deacon and how should they function in the church?
I would say that a deacon is a model servant, an exemplary servant, called by God and recognized by the congregation. And the way I define it, though, is that deacons are assistants to the elders. Now, perhaps some of the churches listening don't have a plurality of elders. That's a different argument. I think that you ought to move in that direction. But, in your church, it might look like deacons being assistants to the staff. But deacons are these formal assistants to the elders who are deployed to do three main things. I would say, number one, spot and meet tangible needs. Number two, protect and promote church unity. And number three, serve and support the ministry of the word. Now, underneath those is a lot of flexibility and application, but I think that those three main things, spotting and meeting tangible needs, protecting and promoting church unity, and serving and supporting the ministry of the word, encompass what the Bible's vision for the diaconate.
Okay, so somebody might be listening to this and thinking like, wait, he said deacons and elders. The church that I grew up in was led by a deacon board, and that was kind of it. They were the governing board of the church. So could you explain quickly the difference there? What do you mean by deacon versus an elder?
Yeah, that's a really common model in a lot of churches, especially in the Baptist world in America over the last 100 years. And the reasons for that, how that came about, are complex. I think that, suffice it to say, the way I kind of frame it in the book is that I think churches can get deacons wrong in one of two directions, either wrongly elevating the role to that of pseudo-elders or wrongly reducing the role to that of just kind of glorified janitors. And what you're asking about is churches that do the former, churches where the deacons are functioning as de facto elders. And I think this is unfortunate. Even if it's well-intended, I think it's unfortunate because not only do you miss out on having biblical elders, but you're also missing out on having biblical deacons. You actually lose the Bible, what the Bible holds out for both of the two offices in the New Testament church if your deacons are functioning as elders. So I would define elders as the shepherds of the whole congregation who lead through the ministry of the word, so teaching and guarding sound doctrine, and they are exercising oversight over the whole flock, whereas deacons are deployed to serve and support them, to serve at their pleasure, as it were, to execute their oversight, their vision, rather than the reverse. So it's not what you have in some churches. You're right. Some churches have no elders. Other churches have basically a bicameral legislature where it's sort of the House and the Senate, and deacons exist to be a counterweight to the elders. So elders govern everything in the church that is spiritual, deacons govern everything that is physical, and it's sort of a stay in your lane kind of mentality. But I think that falls far short of what the Bible envisions for both offices.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many places we could go, so many different directions. You talk a lot in the book about Acts 6, when the Hellenistic widows were being overlooked, and it was brought to the apostles, and they appointed 7 men who took care of that. And so I find a lot of people who see deacons strictly as mercy ministers, or benevolence, people who carry out benevolence in a church. One of the things I appreciate about this book is that there was a broader picture of what the deacon role can be. Could you talk about what you think the role of a deacon can be in today's local church?
Yeah, I don't think that deacons are less than mercy ministers, but I don't think they should be limited to being mercy ministers. And I think we can even see that principle in Acts 6, because what Acts 6 is demonstrating is not specifically that the 7 could only deal with food distribution like problems. I think it's that was the occasion for the establishment of that office, or I would say, the 7 are probably forerunners to the office of deacon. Food was the occasion, but the larger principle that you can apply more broadly throughout the life of the church is that the 7 are being tasked, recognized by the congregation, but being really taking their cues from the apostles, which later in the New Testament would be similar to deacons taking their cues from elders. So sometimes, yes, that's going to have to do with tangible needs, dealing with the poor and the distressed in the life of the congregation. And there's something really beautiful about that. And in fact, there's a sense in which deacons can uniquely Lord Jesus and his ministry as a suffering servant, someone who Luke tells us, was mighty in word and deed. So elders reflect Christ, deacons reflect Christ. But again, I think any way in which deacons can relieve stress and pressure from elders, so kind of functioning like the congregation's offensive lineman, whose job it is to protect the court, he be sacked by an onrush of practical demand, whatever it's like, whether it has to do with mercy ministry or Sunday morning, I think that falls under the category of what the Bible would understand deacons to be and do.
That's really helpful. Here at Northwest Gospel Church, the church that this podcast comes out of, we have deacons in all these different areas, and we talk often about how when the word of God is being preached by elders, but who's going to hear it without our media deacons? We receive communion every week here, and how are we going to remember without those who come early in the morning? And we have a deacon over communion who oversees that team. And so in this book, I found it really helpful. You outline in the chapter of what deacons must do, you talk about 3 different healthy models for today. And number 1 is the mercy minister. It's the ones who do that, the caring for the poor. Number 2 is a team of leading servants, doing they're actually like a board that meets to generate ideas and coordinate plans for addressing different concerns. And then third is this role-specific ministry mobilizers, and that's what we're talking about here. And I was so grateful for that third category, because I feel like a lot of times when I'm trying to read on deacons, it is more focused on just the mercy ministry. And so I can have somebody come to me who's like, hey, I'm the deacon of our young adult ministry that helps bridge high schoolers into the real world. How come people who write on deacons never talk to me or talk to my role there? And so in the book you even have this example of you say some may dismiss such a model, perhaps say a deacon of parking seems rather ridiculous. If parking demands a deacon position, what doesn't? And so what would you say is kind of the qualification for a task that could have a deacon over it?
If it's stressing the elders out, I would say.
Okay.
I mean, at our church, we have basically individual diaconates, that is individual deacon positions or deacon roles that we install certain people into. But those diaconates can be created and dissolved at will based on the needs of the congregation at the time. So, even in the last few years, we have created a deacon of foster care and adoption, because in our church, there were a lot of families entering that process, and it was starting to drain one of the staff pastors' time in particular. And so there was someone in the church that we just thought, hey, they would be a safe pair of hands to be able to spearhead this and absorb the shock of it and help to organize and coordinate communication. So we created that position, but we also dissolved one. We had a deacon of missionary care whose job was to stay in touch with our missionaries and help coordinate care packages and all the rest. We dissolved it, not because we stopped caring about missions, but because we realized that our associate pastor, who a big part of his job is overseeing missions, was able with his own assistant to actually deal with it in a more streamlined process rather than having to bring the deacon in on every conversation with a missionary. So that's a long way of just saying anything that is creating a pressure point in the life of the church, anything that is putting strain or stress on the elders or the congregation as a whole, is at least theoretically something that you could create a diaconal position for to be a pressure release in that area.
Okay, so one of the takeaways from that could be, let's say, let's just use parking as an example, and say that, all right, we realize that parking is a stress point here. We need somebody to oversee that. You take real care in the book to say that just because somebody could do the task well does not qualify them to become a deacon. And you have a whole chapter on the qualifications of a deacon from 1 Timothy 3. And so, like, obviously people can go read those, and you talk about them not being double-tongued and not being addicted to too much wine. You talk about how they need to know to hold fast to the faith and manage their family well, all those things that come from that passage. But why do you think that those 6 bullet points of what a deacon must be and must not do, why do you think those are important for the role of deacon in the local church?
You mean the character?
Yeah.
Question?
Why is the character so important? Because over and over in the book, you're like, this person's good at finances. Shouldn't they be the finance deacon? Maybe, but we can't know yet because we don't know the character. Why is the character so important there?
It's so important because, first of all Christians are called to be deacons, lowercase d, as in generally servant-hearted people. The word diakonos shows up 29 times in the New Testament, and it's rightly translated as servant or minister, i.e. something that applies to all Christians everywhere. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of those times, 25 or 26 of those times, it is not translated as deacon, kind of capital D. Therefore, what it means to be a deacon is not someone who is a servant in the church as opposed to everyone else, but rather someone who is exemplary in their service, someone that the elders want to hold up to the congregation and say, look at this person. They're not perfect, but they have the kind of heart, the kind of character that we want you to emulate. The other reason is because the very purpose of the diaconate is to free the elders up to focus on the ministry of the word and on prayer. And so if you have someone who is not a person of biblical character, godly character, well, then the elders are going to kind of have to that person's going to be a headache when a deacon is supposed to relieve headaches. That person is going to have to be babysat when the whole purpose of the diaconate is that the elders can kind of happily forget about the deacons a little bit because they're just being so faithful and competent in their work. And that's the other thing I'll add to your question is you kind of brought up the two things, character and competence. It's true that, and I think very noteworthy, that the list of qualifications for deacons in 1 Timothy 3 is a character sketch. Mm-hmm. It is not a skill set. Having said that, Just as I said earlier, deacons are not less than mercy ministers, but they shouldn't be limited to mercy ministry. I would also say deacons deacons are not less than biblically qualified people of character, but the Bible says here's what their character needs to be. I think wisdom dictates, yeah, but they need a little competence as well. Because just think about it, Tyler. You could have a person who theoretically meets the biblical qualifications in terms of having that exemplary character, but they just struggle to respond to emails. They regularly flake out on things. They're not. It's not maliciously intended, but they just are not yet a mature, reliable, safe pair of hands. Or you can imagine someone who has the biggest servant's heart in the church, but he has the tendency to hoard service, not to make a name for himself, but just he's the kind of guy, if something needs to be done, he's just going to go do it. Whereas when you're looking for an ideal deacon, you're not wanting to find someone who's going to be a cul-de-sac of service. You're wanting to find someone who's going to mobilize others onto this on-ramp, through this on-ramp, onto this kind of highway of service in the life of the church, this freeway system. And so someone who can organize practical service and mobilize others, basically a lead volunteer who's great at communication. That's what I mean by competence that is helpful to have on top of the biblical character.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, so the book itself, the subtitle of the book is how they serve and strengthen the church. And I think the thing that I kept going back to as I was reading was, man, biblical deacons are so valuable to church unity. They're so important. The way that we define a deacon here, as far as like the role of deacon, is one who's appointed who nurtures church unity by leading or assisting ministries and teams of volunteers so that the practical needs of the church can be met. And so how do you feel like, or how do you think that that biblical deacons strengthen or uphold church unity? Like in a perfect world, what does that look like?
Being people who are quick to see the best and assume the best, being people who are easy to please and hard to offend rather than the reverse, being people who understand that to the degree the elders of the church are able to give themselves to the work of teaching and shepherding, the whole church is going to benefit. And so it's their delight as deacons to, plot behind the scenes for ways that they can make the job of their pastors easier for the good of the whole church and the glory of King Jesus. I think someone who has finely tuned conflict radar. So what I mean by that is someone who doesn't love evangelical or even intra-church soap opera drama. They're not always pushing the drama button. Rather, they are the kind of people who will muffle shockwaves rather than make them reverberate further. In the book, I use the language of deacons as shock absorbers. You don't want people who are going to be sending shockwaves through the congregation by gossiping or assuming the worst or being contentious. You want deacons in your church who are going to be a place where conflict goes to die. And I think we see that principle in Acts 6, and it is I think deacons as shock absorbers is maybe the most overlooked role of deacons in literature and conversations that I hear.
Yeah. One more question. How can local church elders or staff pastors, how can they equip and mobilize deacons in a way that they become those who serve and strengthen the church well?
I mean, I think there are a lot of kind of obvious ways, including being intentional, clear with expectations, clear in teaching about what elders are and therefore what deacons are. So if you're not clear about eldership, then you can't blame people in your congregation for getting deacons wrong. But I think the note that I want to sound, and I'll just turn to the page where I kind of highlight this in the book, and that is that in 1 Timothy 3, Paul lists out the qualifications for elders in verses 1-7, and then deacons in verses 8-12. But he doesn't in verse 13 turn to another topic. Verse 13 is also about deacons, but it's technically not in the qualifications. So why is it there? Well, it's a promise. Paul includes a promise to deacons, which I think is beautiful, Tyler, because he doesn't include a promise to elders. For the elders, it's just, here are the qualifications, let's move on to deacons. But at the end of the list of qualifications for deacons, it's almost like he, through his mind's eye, sees these humble servants laboring for the good of Christ's church in the background, right? Grunt work, not stage work. And he wants to go out of his way to honor them and to put wind in their sails. And so he writes in 1 Timothy 3:13, "For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and also great faith in the confidence that is in Christ Jesus." I love that. Paul didn't have to include it, but he's basically saying, hey, if you serve faithfully as a deacon, even if you feel overlooked and underappreciated, know that there are going to be two things coming your way. One is going to descend to you vertically from above. That is great confidence, boldness in your faith. The other is going to come to you horizontally from the church, and that is increasing respect. So my word to elders and especially to senior pastors is make sure you are going out of your way publicly to honor and thank and champion the work of the deacons in your midst who are busy making your job possible. Deacons are like the congregation's special ops force who are deployed to carry out often unseen tasks with fortitude and joy. So make sure that you make them feel as treasured as deserve to be.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. I want to say thank you, Matt, for writing this book. Oftentimes, whenever I'm approaching somebody who's been tested and proven, who's humbly served for a long while, and I come to them and I say, hey, I think we want to give you the title of deacon in our church, and so let's explore that together. The number one question I get is like, what does that actually mean? Like, what changes? What does that require of me? What's going on there? And so now I thought multiple times while reading this, I'm gonna have to buy a handful of copies of this, because when I get that question, I'm just going to say, here you go. That this will explain it. So thank you so much for writing this book. We'll put a link to this book in the show notes, so you can check it out as well. And Matt, thank you so much for your time today. If people want to follow your work, whether on the Gospel Coalition or otherwise, where's the best place to keep up with what you're doing?
Probably just on Twitter. I don't have a website, a personal website. I'm not on Instagram or anything else. So probably just on Twitter. And if you want to check out my church plant site, it's rivercityrichmond.org. And I would appreciate prayer as listeners think of it as I seek to establish this new gospel witness in Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes. What's the timeline for the launch of the church plant?
Planning to move in early July and have core team meetings through the fall and the winter with a view to constituting as a new church in early 2022.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely be praying for you. And again, thank you so much for writing this book. Even though it may not have been the book that you were born to write, it's definitely helpful to the local church, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Tyler.